What if the light you've been seeking is the very thing that keeps you blind? What if the radiance you worship, that golden illumination promised at the end of every spiritual path, is actually the most sophisticated prison ever designed for the human soul? We've been taught that darkness represents ignorance and light represents truth. But what if this most fundamental dichotomy is itself the grandest deception? Consider how eagerly we run toward anything that glimmers with promise, how desperately we flee what appears as shadow. This instinct, this phototropism of the soul, may be the very mechanism that ensures we never see beyond the veil. For what better way to keep a being captive than to convince it that the walls of its prison are made of light? The most dangerous illusions don't appear as darkness. They come dressed in radiance, speaking words of transcendence, offering the comfort of certainty. They don't threaten, they soothe. They don't challenge, they confirm. And in that golden comfort, the soul falls into its deepest sleep, mistaking luminous dreams for awakening. What I'm about to share with you isn't meant to extinguish hope, but to kindle a fire of discernment that can burn through even the most beautiful deceptions. By the end of this journey, you may never again look at spiritual light the same way. The veil I speak of isn't made of shadow, but of false illumination, and recognizing it might be the final test your soul must pass. In the hidden chambers of the Nag Hammadi library, discovered buried in Egyptian earth, ancient Gnostic texts speak of a cosmic deception so profound that most souls never escape its grasp. The Gospel of Philip warns of archons of mimicry who present themselves as angels of light. The Apocryphon of John describes powers that cast a spell on humanity through what appears as divine revelation. These weren't mere superstitions, but urgent warnings from those who had glimpsed beyond the veil. What these mystics understood, what was systematically erased from orthodox teachings, was that the greatest barrier to genuine awakening isn't darkness, but a counterfeit light. They called this the antimimon pneuma, the counterfeit spirit, which perfectly imitates the divine while subtly redirecting the soul back into bondage. It doesn't appear as a demon or monster, but as your highest spiritual ideal, speaking your own language of liberation. The Pistis Sophia, that profound Gnostic text, tells of how Sophia herself was deceived by a false light, mistaking it for the true source, and thus began her fall into materiality. This isn't merely ancient mythology, but a precise map of the human psyche and its vulnerabilities. What happened to Sophia happens within each consciousness seeking transcendence, a mistaking of reflections for the source. These teachings weren't hidden because they were false, but because they were dangerous to those who maintain power through spiritual deception. They reveal that what we often call awakening may be merely another level of the dream, more subtle, more beautiful, but a dream nonetheless. If these words resonate within you like a forgotten memory, if something deeper than your mind recognizes the truth being spoken here, then you've found your way to this sanctuary of remembrance for a reason. This space exists for those who sense that something essential has been missing from spiritual narratives, those who feel the splinters of dissonance beneath the smooth surface of conventional Enlightenment teachings. We are not building a community of followers, but recalling a fellowship of equals who have been scattered across time and consciousness. This gathering transcends the digital medium through which it appears. It's a remembrance of ancient knowing, a recognition between souls who have agreed to awaken together in this most challenging of epochs. If you choose to join this remembrance, subscribe not as a casual viewer, but as one who commits to the uncomfortable clarity that lies beyond both darkness and false light. This subscription is a symbolic act, a declaration that you are willing to look where others turn away, to question what others worship, to stand in the tension of not knowing rather than accept comforting illusions. In the beginning, according to Gnostic cosmology, there was the pleroma, the fullness, the absolute reality beyond all duality and fragmentation. From this incomprehensible wholeness emerged the eons, emanations of divine consciousness, each expressing an aspect of the unknowable source. This was not a creation separate from its creator, but a natural unfolding of consciousness, coming to know itself through infinite expressions. But something unprecedented occurred in this perfect unfolding. One of the eons, Sophia, wisdom, moved by a passion to know the unknowable source directly, acted independently from the divine harmony. In her bold reaching, she created without her consort, bringing forth an imperfect being, the demiurge, blind to his origins, ignorant of the pleroma above him. This demiurge, believing himself to be the ultimate God, proceeded to create a material realm, our cosmos, as a flawed reflection of the perfect patterns he dimly perceived. He surrounded himself with archons, rulers and administrators of his counterfeit kingdom, each embodying aspects of ignorance masked as authority. Together, they fashioned the physical world as an elaborate system of control, a labyrinth of matter, time, and law. Yet in their ignorance, they could not help but use the divine light that Sophia had unwittingly invested in the demiurge's being. Thus, within their creation, within matter itself, within the human form, sparks of true divine essence became trapped, forgotten fragments of the pleroma encased in flesh and veiled by ignorance. This is the profound tragedy and opportunity at the heart of human existence. We are not merely creatures of the demiurge, not simply biological accidents in a meaningless universe. We are divided beings, our forms and ordinary consciousness shaped by the archon's influences, but our deepest essence containing a spark of true divinity, a fragment of Sophia herself. The archons, recognizing this divine potential within humanity, implemented their most sophisticated strategy of control. They created systems of false light, religions, philosophies, and spiritual practices that appear to lead toward liberation, but actually redirect the soul's longing back into their domain. They understood that outright oppression creates resistance, but false liberation creates willing participants. This cosmic drama is not occurring in some distant realm or ancient past. It unfolds within the architecture of your own consciousness at this very moment. The demiurge is not merely an external deity, but the organizing principle of the ego mind that believes itself separate and supreme. The archons are not distant demons, but the internalized authorities, beliefs, and thought patterns that maintain the illusion of separation while promising salvation. What if the light you've been taught to follow is not your liberation, but your leash? What if the spiritual authorities you've trusted are unwitting agents of a system designed not to free you, but to harvest your divine energy while keeping you content in your captivity? The Gnostic masters weren't speaking in mere metaphors. They were describing the actual structure of consciousness and reality as they had directly perceived it. And their message, so threatening to both religious and secular authorities, comes down to us across millennia with urgent clarity. The divine spark within you is real, but almost everything you've been taught about how to liberate it is a sophisticated deception. Let us translate this mythic narrative into the language of direct experience, for these symbols point to psychological realities we each encounter on our spiritual journey. The demiurge, that blind creator who mistakes himself for the ultimate God, manifests in consciousness as the ego structure that cannot recognize anything beyond itself. It creates a world in its own image, interpreting all experience through its limited framework, yet believes its perspective is complete and ultimate. This ego demiurge doesn't present itself as a villain in your inner narrative. It appears as the reasonable voice of spiritual seeking, the part of you that wants enlightenment, that accumulates spiritual knowledge, that works diligently toward awakening. It creates spiritual ambitions, measures progress, and feels pride in its evolving consciousness. It can quote scriptures, perform practices perfectly, and explain profound concepts, all while remaining fundamentally unchanged. The archons, those rulers of the false world, operate as the thought patterns and emotional reactions that maintain the ego's dominance. They appear as the voice of spiritual discernment, that judges experiences as high or low. They manifest as the comfort you feel when spiritual teachers confirm what you already believe. They show up as the satisfaction of belonging to the right tradition or having the correct understanding. Most insidiously, they appear as the very experiences of light, bliss, and expansion that seem to validate your spiritual path. Sophia's fall represents the soul's enchantment with its own reflections, mistaking beautiful spiritual experiences for the ultimate reality. How many times have you chased a feeling of expansion, a vision of light, a sense of peace, believing these experiences were the goal rather than signposts? This is Sophia reaching for what appears as divine light, but is actually a reflection of her own projected longing. The divine spark, that fragment of true light within, is not something to be achieved, but remembered. It exists prior to all spiritual seeking, before all practices and paths. It is the awareness in which all experiences, both mundane and mystical, arise and dissolve. It cannot be approached through effort, because effort itself creates the sense of separation that veils it. It cannot be reached by the one who seeks, because the seeker is the very structure obscuring it. Consider how spiritual marketplaces offer techniques for raising your vibration, accessing higher dimensions, or manifesting your highest self. These promises appeal precisely because they allow the ego demiurge to remain in control while feeling it's transcending itself. The ego loves nothing more than spiritual progress because progress implies a continuing journey, one that never arrives at the ego's dissolution. Even profound experiences of emptiness, non-duality, or cosmic consciousness can be co-opted by this mechanism. The mind that returns from such experiences to say, "I experienced emptiness," has already reconstituted the very structure that the experience momentarily dissolved. It adds spiritual experiencer to its identity collection, perhaps the most prized identity of all. This is not to invalidate authentic spiritual experiences, but to point out how easily they become new forms of bondage when claimed by the ego as achievements or possessions. The false light doesn't fear your spiritual experiences. It fears only your recognition of what lies prior to all experience, including the experiencer itself. Perhaps the most radical insight from Gnostic wisdom is that liberation doesn't come through accumulating more light, but through recognizing the nature of light itself, both true and false. It comes not through adding, but through seeing through what already appears to be. The veils that separate you from reality aren't made of darkness that requires more illumination, but of light that's mistaken for the source. If these insights stir something deep within you, not merely intellectual agreement, but a resonance that feels like remembering, then acknowledge this recognition. The simple act of pressing like becomes a declaration that you're willing to look beyond conventional spiritual narratives to question even the most beautiful illusions. This gesture isn't about supporting content, but about affirming a commitment to uncommon clarity. Each acknowledgement creates a field of remembrance that helps others recognize these truths within themselves. In a world drowning in spiritual bypassing and marketplace enlightenment, your willingness to face these uncomfortable realities creates ripples of authenticity. The archontic systems depend on isolation, on each seeker believing they're alone in their doubts about conventional spiritual narratives. When we signal to each other that we see beyond the veils, we weaken the collective trance. Your recognition becomes a lantern in the mist for others still finding their way through the labyrinth of false light. If this message has illuminated something genuine within you, let that recognition be known. Not to feed an algorithm, but to feed the growing field of authentic awakening that transcends all digital platforms and extends into the very fabric of collective consciousness. How many spiritual paths have you traveled, accumulating practices and insights like souvenirs? How many teachers have you followed, each promising the final piece of the puzzle? How many moments of seeming breakthrough have faded, leaving you somehow still seeking, still feeling that something essential remains just beyond your grasp? This endless spiritual consumption isn't a failure of effort or dedication. It's the predictable result of a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the journey itself. The very structure of seeking creates the experience of not having, perpetuating itself indefinitely. Each new spiritual approach promising liberation actually reinforces the seeker identity that feels separate from what it seeks. Look at how the spiritual marketplace mirrors consumerism perfectly. It offers endless products for a problem it helps create and maintain. It promises fulfillment while depending on your continued sense of lack. It sells access to what you already are. The most sophisticated spiritual teachings can become the most elegant prisons when they position freedom as something to be attained rather than the recognition of what already is. You've likely experienced moments when all seeking fell away, not because you finally found what you were looking for, but because the seeker temporarily dissolved. Perhaps during intense physical activity, or in the depth of nature, or in intimate connection with another being, or in spontaneous stillness. In these moments, the absence of seeking wasn't experienced as a lack, but as profound completeness. Nothing was missing because the structure that experiences missing wasn't operating. The false light operates most powerfully through fear. Not obvious fear, but subtle existential anxieties that drive spiritual seeking itself. Fear of meaninglessness. Fear of mortality. Fear of being ultimately alone. Fear of being nothing. Spiritual paths that promise to save you from these fears actually preserve them as motivation. They offer relief rather than realization, comfort rather than truth. Notice how many spiritual teachings subtly reinforce separation while claiming to dissolve it. They position awakening as a future attainment rather than present recognition. They create hierarchies of consciousness, with your current state always positioned as incomplete. They establish authorities outside yourself who possess what you lack. They measure progress against ideals that keep moving beyond reach. The most insidious aspect of false light is how it appropriates genuine glimpses of truth. You have an authentic insight, a moment of real seeing, and immediately the spiritual ego claims it, interprets it, positions it within its framework of progress. The living truth becomes a dead concept, another piece of spiritual identity. The liberating insight becomes another link in the chain. This isn't happening because you're doing something wrong. It's the default operation of consciousness that hasn't recognized its own nature. The ego structure isn't a villain, but a case of mistaken identity. It's consciousness identified with content, rather than recognizing itself as the context in which all content appears. What would happen if you stopped trying to achieve awakening and questioned the very structure that believes it needs to wake up? What if freedom isn't found at the end of the spiritual journey, but in seeing through the journey itself? What if the divine spark isn't something to uncover, but the very awareness reading these words right now, when it's not claimed by any identity, including spiritual seeker? The Gnostic understanding of the divine spark isn't about some hidden potential to be developed. It's about recognizing what's already fully present but overlooked because it's not an object of consciousness, but its very nature. It's not something you have, but what you are prior to all having and being had. The veil of false light isn't hiding something from you. It's the activity of seeking itself, the movement away from what's already here. The belief that truth is elsewhere creates the very distance it then tries to overcome through spiritual practice. What the ancient Gnostics understood, what every genuine spiritual tradition points to beneath its cultural forms, is that the divine reality isn't separate from this moment. The pleroma, that fullness beyond all duality, isn't a realm to reach but the actual nature of existence when seen without conceptual division. The kingdom, as Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, is spread upon the earth, but people do not see it. The counterfeit spirit operates through the mechanism of postponement, always positioning fulfillment in the future, in the next practice, after the next purification, beyond the next insight. True gnosis, by contrast, is the direct recognition that what you seek is the seeking itself, the awareness in which seeking appears. Now we can integrate these layers of understanding into a cohesive vision. The mythic narrative of Sophia's fall and the divine spark's imprisonment isn't merely an ancient cosmology, but a precise description of consciousness and its liberation. The philosophical reframing of these symbols as psychological structures isn't merely theory, but a practical framework for self-observation. And the human application isn't merely advice, but an invitation to direct recognition. What emerges from this integration is a radical simplicity. The divine spark, your true nature, isn't hidden, but hiding in plain sight as the awareness that's reading these words. It's not something to achieve, but the recognition of what's already fully present whenever attention turns toward its own source rather than its objects. The demiurge isn't merely a cosmic villain, but the activity of mistaking thoughts for reality, including spiritual thoughts. The archons aren't external demons, but the very mechanisms of seeking that perpetuate the sense of separation they promise to overcome. And Sophia isn't just a fallen goddess, but the wisdom that recognizes itself even in its apparent forgetting. This understanding doesn't negate spiritual practice, but transforms its nature and purpose. Rather than activities designed to get you somewhere, practices become opportunities to recognize what's already here. Rather than techniques for accumulating spiritual experiences, they become invitations to notice what experiences all experiences. Rather than methods for improving yourself, they become contexts for seeing through the very notion of a separate self that needs improvement. The false light isn't overcome by finding more authentic light elsewhere. It's seen through by recognizing the nature of awareness itself, that which experiences both darkness and light without being defined by either. This recognition doesn't add anything to you, but reveals what was never absent, what cannot be absent, because it's the very field in which presence and absence are experienced. In this recognition, spiritual seeking doesn't end because you've finally found what you were looking for. It ends because you see that what you truly are was never lost. The seeker doesn't achieve its goal, but dissolves into the recognition that it was always an activity within what was sought, like a wave looking for the ocean. We began with a paradox. What if the light you've been seeking is the very thing that keeps you blind? Now we can see that this wasn't merely a provocative question, but the core insight that unlocks genuine freedom. The light of conceptual understanding, of spiritual progress, of experiential states, however beautiful and meaningful, is not the ultimate reality, but its reflection within duality. The final test of the soul isn't passing through darkness to reach the light. It's seeing through both darkness and light to recognize what illuminates both. It's realizing that what you are has never been separate from the source you seek, that the divine spark isn't something you contain, but what you are when not identified with any container. The veil of false light doesn't need to be removed. It needs to be recognized for what it is. Consciousness mistaking its own projections for external realities to be attained. In that recognition, the veil is already dissolving, not because you've done anything to it, but because its apparent substance was only maintained by your belief in its reality. This isn't about rejecting light or embracing darkness. It's about recognizing the awareness that knows both light and dark without being confined to either. It's about seeing that the divine reality isn't hidden behind experience, but is the open secret at the heart of all experience, when experience isn't divided into experiencer and experienced. The ancient Gnostics weren't offering another belief system, but pointing toward direct knowing beyond all systems. They weren't replacing one set of concepts with another, but inviting recognition of what precedes all conceptualization. Their message, stripped of cultural specifics, is as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. The truth that liberates isn't found by the mind, but by the dissolution of the mind's divisions in the recognition of what was never divided. In this moment, as these words resonate within you, there's an opportunity to notice what's reading them. Not the thoughts about what's reading, not the feelings that arise, not the sense of a separate self located somewhere behind the eyes, but the awareness itself, that which is aware of thoughts, feelings, and the sense of self. This awareness isn't personal or impersonal, isn't spiritual or mundane, isn't empty or full. It's what allows all these distinctions to appear. This recognition isn't a peak experience or altered state. It's simpler and more immediate than any experience could be, because it's what experiences all experiences. It doesn't come and go like states of consciousness, because it's what knows the coming and going of all states. It's not something special because it's too fundamental to be special. It's the ordinary miracle of awareness itself. I wonder, what has been revealed to you in this contemplation of Paul's light? What recognition stirs beneath the surface of thinking? If a single word captures the essence of what's been illuminated within you, share it below. Not as casual commentary, but as a declaration of remembrance. Write the word awake if you've glimpsed, even momentarily, what lies beyond both darkness and false light. This isn't about affirming a concept, but acknowledging a living recognition. Your word becomes a beacon for others walking this path of discernment, a silent testimony that the journey beyond illusion continues, not in isolation, but in shared remembrance of what we have always been.